Okay. Thanks for coming, everyone. Now we have I think, a provocative topic. We have had a lot of discussions about the future of the United States in a world after bin Laden, with different kind of defense expenditures, and there are probably some questions about why the IT policy guy invited some defense guy to talk about war and stuff. Pretty simple answer that begins in a hotel suite in New Orleans. The sordid details are that a few years ago, the International Studies Association decided to let us have a panel on cyberspace and international conflict and things spawning from that. And we gave a set of papers, and Dr. Vacca was one of the guys who submitted a paper, and I was as good academics do, I sat as a discussant or chair or both, because it was a small panel, and they put us in a hotel suite in a very tiny room and said, who will come to a talk about cyberspace and international affairs and conflict? It was a very full suite. I mean, it wasn't as full a suite if perhaps Aerosmith had been throwing a party there, but it ended up being a very full room, and I think everyone was very impressed that it was a very full room for this very odd topic. So, and Alex gave a great talk about conflict, something that he has to think about working for a large defense concern, which I'm sure that he will say he is not speaking officially for today. I think that's in the program as well. But long story short, Alex wrote a paper last year that I thought was very impressive, where he basically said, we prepare for this big war stuff, and we do these small wars far more often. And we don't think about them in a way we should, and we don't prepare for them in a way we should. And he made some very provocative arguments about how the Defense Department should think about the conflicts it ends up being in. Now, not to steal his words. So with that, I thank you for coming to the Baker Institute. Please come out. I know we have far too many luminaries and notable speakers for everyone to come to all of them, and it's been an especially busy semester this semester. But I will defer to the bio in the pamphlet on Dr. Vacca, other than to say that he's a fellow mixed social scientist, and leave it at that. So, Alex Vacca, everyone, thanks.
As Chris alluded to, and I have to say it as well, the views expressed here are my own. They are not reflective of my employer, its employees, its shareholders, its customers, anybody else affiliated who's wearing a logo T-shirt. They are strictly my own views. I also wanted to, sort of before I got going, really thank Chris, Melissa, and Isabel here, who made this a really special day. And it's really been wonderful. My first time here in Houston and at Rice. I just want to say it's very impressive, and I'm really enjoying myself down here. You've got an amazing facility and amazing resources down here. But what I really wanted to do, just as sort of Chris sort of suggested with a somewhat subversive introduction, was I was curious about how I could get the Army to publish Wittgenstein. And that's actually sort of where this thing began. This was a quote that I first saw on the wall of my high school English teacher, who argued that this was very important. We should keep this in mind. And it took me many years before I remembered what he told us. But the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And what sort of began to occur to me is we started talking about irregular warfare, and we used an entirely different vocabulary to describe it. When we started talking about irregular warfare, the terms were different, the concepts were different. Everything that we used was very different with how we talked about regular warfare. And I began to wonder, does this distinction between irregular warfare and regular warfare make a lot of sense? And where did this distinction come about? And what you sort of see is that is sort of the historical, sort of notion of what is the origins of modern warfare. And if you take a good international relations, international security class, you'll get this sort of standard narrative of the way that warfare has sort of progressed and gone forward. And that's that the French modern warfare begins with the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleonic warfare. And you'll read all about Austerlitz, Jena, Ulm, Auerstadt, these wonderful Napoleonic battles. And then that will really sort of be the focus of things and sort of the beginning of warfare. And that'll take you through what happens to the rise of the Prussian system. And so you'll study a little bit about Clausewitz, you'll study about the reforms of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and you'll get into sort of Moltke the Elder, who embodies the Prussian system and is able to lead the French forces, or the Prussian forces during the Franco-Prussian War. With the crushing defeat of the French forces at the Battle of Sedan, which leads to the capture of the emperor, the destruction of the greatest French field army. Really, it's sort of the culmination of the war. And this was a good traditional sort of heavy regular war. And that takes you to sort of the emergence of modern warfare up through World War I, where you had the Russo-Japanese War and the Second Boer War. And when you study them, you really focus on the large battles. Even the Second Boer War, which people recognize had a little bit of difference to it. You began with why did the British lose some of their first major conventional battles, and how did Lord Robertson, when he got in there, reform the British, change the tactics a little bit, and go off and win some major battles. And so the history of warfare up to this point, and once you get into World War I, then you're totally focused on regular warfare. But it's all this sort of narrative that you can tell, sort of talking about these sort of large set piece battles. Except the trouble that I found is you look at these wars, you discover that even in these wars, irregular warfare was actually an important part of it. The French Revolution, you have an important occurrence called the Counter-Revolution of Vendée, which we're going to talk a little bit more about as I go forward. That was in many ways co-equal with some of the Napoleonic battles in terms of the lessons it taught the French and the effect it had on the Revolutionary War. You also had the rise of the Prussian system in the Franco-Prussian War, but you realize the Franco-Prussian War didn't end with the capture of the emperor. Instead, what happens is the French government under Leon Gambetta reforms and says we're going to go off and we're going to continue to fight. They form something called the Government of National Defense. They raise new armies, and the Prussians spend the better part of a year running around France trying to bring these new armies to battles and can't. And the Prussians are very, very frustrated. And finally, the Russo-Japanese War is a topic that actually I could talk about at great length, and so I won't. But the Second Boer War, after the conventional warfare largely grinds to a halt, and the British, win it by defeating the Boer field armies, the Boers adopt very different tactics, and all of a sudden, the British are sort of drawn into an irregular war, as late as 1902. And of course, we've heard, the modern historiography of irregular warfare, looking at Vietnam and sort of thereafter, I think is pretty well understood. But you look at this sort of overview of history, you realize that irregular warfare is not a new thing. In fact, what we began to think of as irregular warfare has existed at least since the dawn of modern regular warfare. And oftentimes, there are elements of the same thing. You could go to World War I and you could say, yes, the Western Front looked one way, but battles on the Eastern Front were conducted in a somewhat different way. And certainly if you go off and look at what Lawrence of Arabia was doing and Allenby was doing down in the Ottoman Turkish Empire, you see very different kinds of battles. And so you see that these things sort of coexist. Now, why do they coexist? And that's that I want to get warfare sort of overall, go back to what Clausewitz said, war is an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. That is warfare. And you start to say, well, what's different about this in irregular warfare? And you realize nothing is different about this in irregular warfare. If the opposition in some of these particular wars, even if we go forward to Iraq and Afghanistan today, if they could defeat U.S. forces by using regulation 1870 cavalry tactics, they would do it. They are looking for any use of force that's able to compel their enemy to do their will. That's what warfare is really about. Everything else is simply a discussion not of strategy, not of military operations, but of different kinds of tactics. And if all you're doing is talking about different kinds of tactics, what you really need to be doing is having a discussion about different kinds of tactics and not calling it a different kind of war. And if you lose sight of the fact that you're using force to try and compel the enemy to do our will, you're sort of opening yourself up to a lot of mistakes. Now, we sort of mentioned, I glossed over these examples in the very beginning, but I want to talk a little bit further about the counter-revolution of Vendée. During the French Revolution, the monarchy and the Catholic Church are sort of both overthrown by the revolutionary forces and the establishment of the revolutionary government. Now, in the region of the Vendée was a more conservative region. They were actually more upset about the overthrow of the Catholic Church and the religious leaders than they were about the royalty itself, although they adopted the royalist cause. And they actually went off and they had no formal field armies. They were a bunch of loosely organized people who were organized into, they called themselves armies, but they really weren't. They had no heavy artillery. They had no cavalry, really. They just had the weapons that were in their houses and what they could get from a few local arsenals. And it was really sort of going off and saying we no longer recognize the authority of the revolutionary government, of the French Republicans. We are reestablishing the Catholic Church. And the Republicans were somewhat dismayed by this. And during the War of the First Coalition, which they were fighting sort of conventional battles against the forces on their eastern frontier, they send into the region of the Vendée a Republican field army, which disappears. The irregulars, the Vendéan irregulars, they ambush them. They divide up into small groups. They do not fight large set-piece battles. A few soldiers will go off and do ambushing, sniping, and then disappear. You try and chase these down by sending small groups after them. Your small groups never come back. Your field army gets smaller and smaller. You keep going off. You keep occupying things. There's no capital city to take. There's no general to take. There's no king to capture, and the army simply disappears. So they send a second army in. Same thing happens, and they actually realize they're actually in a bit of a problem here because they have no way of dealing with this. And so the French Republican military is writing back to France about how this is really a difficult problem. They don't know what the solution is to this, and they come up with, well, maybe we just have to go around and kill lots of people. And so the historiography of the Vendée, when you read it in the English language, it really sort of talks about the beginning of a deliberate campaign of genocide in a Western European country, and they would go into towns. They would round up the women and children, more importantly than the men, because the men would usually escape. They would kill them in really actually horrible ways. They'd burn the crops. They do all these things, not because it was a way to actually win a battle, but because they thought if eventually we can grind away at every single one of these towns and eliminate them and eliminate the population, we eventually will put an end to this insurrection. Ultimately, they have some success doing this, but they keep getting ambushed, and what ends up happening for the French Republicans, that in a way was a bit of good fortune, is that the Vendéans didn't realize that they themselves had hit upon a rather interesting set of tactics, and so as they began to have more success, they began to shift to what they thought was going back into regular warfare. They went off and they laid siege to the town of Nantes, and they did that without any field artillery and without a lot of the heavy siege equipment that you would need, and they actually exhausted their forces trying to storm a Republican fortress, rather than going off and using small group tactics, ambush, and other things like that to go off and deal with them. Once their forces were exhausted, the French Republicans came back and continued their campaign to sort of wipe people from the Vendée. And actually, at the time, you get a shift in French writing. They stopped calling it the Vendée and started calling it the Venge. Vengeance was a French word. And that was what they named the area. And it was just simply a matter of going off and eliminating the towns, eliminating the people, men, women, children, everything. And eventually, they thought this was a solution. And this goes on for the better part of 10, 15 years. And it actually, even when Napoleon takes over, he's still trying to tamp down bits of the revolution over there. It takes a long time and eventually ends with this total exhaustion of the people. The interesting thing is the historiography of this part of the French Revolution is very minimal. If you go off and you read the books on revolutionary tactics, Napoleonic tactics, you will read about the Vendée as a bit of a footnote while they're going off and talking about the wars of the First and the Second Coalition, which use sort of more traditional tactics. The Franco-Prussian War ends up being, this great example of the triumph of regular warfare. And certainly, if you go off and you take the standard gloss of what happened in the Franco-Prussian War, you read about the great Prussian set-piece battle victories in Sedan, Gravelotte, Metz, and a few others, where Prussian armies engaged other French field armies and using maneuver and artillery and cavalry went off, brought these things to battle, and ultimately destroyed the French armies and these things. The trouble is that even though they'd captured Napoleon III, the government of national defense was formed, Gambetta, and he was actually backed with Giuseppe Garibaldi, came up out of Italy with an army of volunteers as well, and they said, we do not recognize the surrender of the French. We don't care that you have the emperor. We're going to keep fighting, and the Prussians didn't know what to do with it. And so you have Moltke the Elder, who went off and designed the Prussian military system and wins these series of tremendously successful regular battles. But he doesn't know what to do. And his letters back to the Prussian government are increasingly desperate. He doesn't understand what to do. He begins to ask for more troops. He eventually just decides that the only way to put an end to these armies, which are running around, they're sniping at Prussian formations, there's small groups, there are ambushes. The Prussians would again detach small forces to chase down these small groups. The small forces would never come back. They would be ambushed and sort of eliminated. So the only way to do this is to sort of mobilize the whole of Prussian manpower, not just the army, bring everybody in, occupy France, build fences throughout the countryside, tear up all the farms, burn down all the cities, execute all the people, and eventually you can pacify the French. This is a great and dramatic departure from winning a bunch of battles and destroying field armies. Instead, this is really how do you defeat a population, and the only thing you can come up with after all the tactics fail is you just have to eliminate the population entirely. And here again, we see something else intriguing happen. The only reason that the Germans or the Prussians end up winning this war is the government of national defense changes its strategy. They've had some successes sniping at the Prussians, but they themselves are not really taking back their country. They're sort of in this sort of nasty stalemate, which are exhausting to the Prussians, but is not having any results for them. And so they shift their tactics back to try and form a bunch of regular battles again. And so they go off and they engage the Prussians, the battles of Le Mans, Saint-Quentin, and La Seine, and they're defeated because they lack heavy artillery, they lack cavalry, they lack all the major equipment. They just have men with rifles who don't understand large group formations, amateurs really, with a few professional officers sort of sprinkled in to leaven them and guide them. But by and large, these are amateur soldiers. And so once they shift tactics to fight a major set-piece battle, the Prussians defeat them, and after that, that ends up ending the war, and the French come to terms. Now, when you read the historiography of the Franco-Prussian War, you will spend all your time on the set-piece battles, and you would get the sense, and you could be forgiven for getting the sense, that the war ends with the capture of Napoleon and the defeat of the French field armies. It doesn't. It goes on for 8 months longer during this whole time of occupation, and even no less a mind than Moltke the Elder cannot figure out how to end it. And finally, we have the Second Boer War. Now, this is a case where actually most of the historiography recognizes that this war was a little bit different. The Boer, I won't get into sort of why this war sort of breaks out, but what eventually happens is the Boers have some tremendous initial success. The British put in an army under Redvers Buller. It is totally defeated in a series of really nasty, disastrous battles over the course of a week of regular conventional battles, and that the British appear to sort of be at wit's end. Instead, what happens is the British replace commanders. They bring in Lord Richardson. He comes in. He fights. He brings the Boer armies to battle. He takes the Boer capital, and officially that's the end of the war. Except what happens is the Boer farmers go off and they have their rifles, their own rifles. They again do not have large formations anymore. They break into these groups called commandos, and they're small groups, somewhat mounted because most of them own horses, but no really sort of heavy cavalry, no artillery, none of the other sort of regular fortifications. And they go off and they start sniping and ambushing and hit and run tactics, which gradually began to wear down the forces of British occupation, which have taken the capital city, but suddenly find that they have not ended resistance. And in fact, the British began to suffer increasingly high losses. Now, in this particular case, the British come up with a relatively effective response, and it's somewhat brutal. And actually, they began to divide up the countryside. They began to burn down the farms. They actually take a lot of the Boer population, the civilian population, and they concentrate them in camps, which they call them concentration camps. And they actually go off and they reconfigure the South African countryside. And what happens is they win. The Boer resistance begins to break down, but the British public turns against the war, and they really can't believe that this is what's going on. And so it ends up being a very unpopular war in Britain, even though they end up finally winning. The negotiations there really sort of set up the Republic of South Africa in a somewhat different situation than sort of the other British colonies. And so even the peace is somewhat changed because the British themselves are not comfortable with the tactics that they use to eventually go off and defeat the Boer commandos. But they did defeat them. Now, there's some common themes when you look at these examples. First of all, there's a theme of tactical asymmetries. The Vendée revolutionaries, the French, the Army of National Defense, and the Boer began to use very different tactics. When one army comes in and wants to fight a set-piece battle because they're going to win a set-piece battle because they have superiority in material, artillery, cavalry, infantry, more training, tighter formations, they're able to succeed in all this. The weaker force realizes that if they would try to fight a regular battle, they would lose, as indeed the French did in the first part of the Franco-Prussian War, and as the Boer did in the the part of the Boer War. So they changed tactics. That makes sense. Whatever tactics work, they'll try them. And so they switch to these dispersed groups. They do not have regular forces in terms of using sort of large formations of professional military. You instead have a lot of amateurs who are skilled marksmen perhaps, and you begin sniping. You began using hit and run tactics. You began ambushing. You began playing tricks. You do not try to bring your enemy's field army to battle. You just pick away at the sides, and you make it very costly for them. You make it very uncomfortable for them, and you never quite give up. And so what happens is you have a preoccupation with tactical innovation. The military writing, if you look at the French Republicans, if you look at Moltke, and if you look at the British, they stopped talking about the strategy of the war. They spent all their time talking about tactical innovation. If the enemies have an irregular tactic, how can we develop a tactic that's better than that? And so the whole focus of the battle shifts from how do you go off and win the war? Remember, war is an active force to compel the enemy to do our will. You're no longer talking about compelling the enemy to do our will. You start shifting to how do I counter these tactics? What tactical innovation do I need to deal with another tactical innovation? And so what you end up with is strategic confusion at best, or strategic absence at worst. And you have an intense frustration that sort of leads back to your the regular belligerents. The armies of the French Republicans, Moltke's armies, and the British armies were very, very frustrated by these wars. They weren't simply suffering losses. They didn't know how to win, and it was a very painful experience for the officers and the men who were fighting because they just couldn't figure anything out. Now, the reason I am sort of concerned in raising this argument is that we tend to dismiss all these examples as irregular warfare. Once you dismiss them as irregular warfare, this leads to sort of inductive and deductive failures in the way you think about war. Once you've gone off and said, well, this is irregular, you're unable to apply the lessons of past experience. You treat it as a new war, sui generis, unlike anything else. As a result, there's no past experience which you can possibly apply to it. So what you see, for example, in more recent irregular warfare campaigns, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, we had past experience that probably we could have brought to bear a lot sooner on that. We didn't use it because we didn't recognize these wars as part of other irregular wars, which had lessons to teach us. And so as a result, you have to relearn lessons of tactics and operations quite painfully over time because you treat these as irregular events, rare one-offs, very different. You don't get to draw back. You don't get to apply these lessons, and so you have to learn them again. If the Prussians look back at the Vendée, they would have discovered what the French learned, what the French Republicans learned in dealing with French resistance and how to fight them and how not to fight them. And if people are ambushing you, do not divide your force into smaller and smaller forces and try and go chase down those who ambush you, because all you do is set yourself up for another ambush. This lesson comes over and over again, but you have to relearn it every time because you don't recognize this part and parcel of the same thing. You have this preoccupation with tactics, as I mentioned before, and you have the strange disjunction between civil and military strategy. And so one thing that I noticed, which is not part of my overall argument, but it seems strangely suggestive, is that if you go back to read Clausewitz, Clausewitz talks about war as being, inherently political and being set up for political objectives. And he says if you remove the political governor from war, war will lead to, total war, which in the Clausewitzian extreme is just absolute destruction. And what you end up seeing is this is precisely what happens. Once you have, said we're going to focus on tactics only, once you forget about the strategy, every example shows the military by itself can think of no other option other than the complete and total destruction of the enemy's population, from the Vendée into the Vendée. you had Moltke the Elder who was talking about these giant cauldron battles, which is how he planned to fight the French. And he ends up talking about in his letters back home to the government, Exterminationskrieg, extermination warfare, as the only way to go off and deal with the French, because there's nothing that can bring them to battle. You have to go off. And these were the terms he used. In the case of the Boer War, you had the emergence of the term concentration camp, and you went from set-piece battles that were going off to bring the Boers to heel to how do we round up and pacify the entire population. And this was just simply because you lost the strategy and the political reason why you were fighting the war, and you were focused simply on defeating the tactics. Not having a way to do that, you just had greater and greater destruction, which is exactly what Clausewitz would have predicted. You also have inductive failures. And this is, once you've gone off and declared something as irregular warfare, you exclude it from your knowledge base of regular warfare. So you've actually learned lessons from this irregular war, but rather than going off and filing it away in terms of, lessons learned in war, you say, well, this is an irregular war. It's not regular. We don't have to incorporate these lessons into our broader body of knowledge about warfare. And so we will write an interesting military history, and perhaps if a military historian happens to read, if they're interested in the Vendée, they may happen to read about tactics, but it's not really part of the historiography of warfare at the time. If you're interested in the Franco-Prussian War, you have to look really, really hard to read about the second phase of the Franco-Prussian War. Everybody can read about Sedan and Metz and the big battles, but these other parts of the war are filed away separately. A few military historians and specialists may know about them, but by and large, the security studies community does not, even though they know about the Franco-Prussian War as a triumph of sort of Moltke's set-piece battles. And so what happens is the conclusions drawn from your biased knowledge base will themselves be biased. If you've excluded examples of all irregular warfare from your knowledge of what warfare is, you go back and you say, well, how do I plan for the next war? You go back and reach into your knowledge base of war, and your knowledge base of war consists of what you considered regular warfare. So you went off and you go off and you say, well, gee, it'll be like the large set-piece battles in the first part of the Franco-Prussian War. It'll be like, big battles in the Russo-Japanese War. It'll be like the big battles in the Western Front in World War I. And so you begin to draw from a biased data set. You start excluding these small wars because they don't rise to the importance of a regular war. Instead, you're simply looking at a subset. So every time you do this, then, and you're faced with an irregular war, you don't have anything to draw back on. And the historiography is very episodic. It's not a holistic thing. And peacetime and pre-war planning, based on such a knowledge base, will also be flawed. If you're going off and planning for war, if you go back and you say, well, I need to plan for war again, what do I know about war? And all you go back and look at is large wars where large field armies, engage one another. You're going to start planning for large battles again. You're going to look to say, well, how do I deal with World War I type things? How do I deal with Western Front World War I type things rather than Lawrence of Arabia kind of type things. And you start looking strictly at only narrow subset, and your planning and the procurement you do based on that planning ends up also being biased. You end up building for the large, big war which you know how to fight, rather than planning for an irregular war because it's irregular, it's excluded. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And finally, you get this strange phenomenon of actually unlearning lessons. If you read the lessons drawn by the military historians about the Napoleonic period, one of the first terms you learn in your sort of bad French, focused on military terminology, is the levée en masse, which is how Napoleon's actually able to raise big armies. You don't learn anything at all about guerrilla warfare, when in fact the very term guerrilla warfare comes up because of the resistance in the Peninsular Campaign that was fought by the Spanish against Napoleon. And so you don't even learn that the origin of the term is Napoleonic warfare. You instead study Napoleon's great battles, which I admit are a lot of fun to study. You look at the Franco-Prussian War. You study Sedan, and you certainly learn about Moltke, and you learn about the Prussian way of war. You don't notice the fact that the Prussian way of war is totally unable to deal with civilian resistance and irregular resistance in the second half of the war. And the Prussian military system, embodied by no less a personage than Moltke the Elder himself, is unable to come up with any solution other than kill them all. British and tactical retrogression of 1904-1914, you had the British army coming out of the Boer War that was actually a pretty sophisticated army. In addition to the things they did with dealing with the civilians, a lot of Robertson's reform actually helped place the British army into a relatively modern field army. Except what happens between 1904 and 1914 is they systematically forget these lessons. They go back to actually using older infantry tactics, which lead them to disasters actually in World War I. And you finally have this what I call the late discovery of the Stoßtruppen tactics. Now, for those of you who are sort of World War I people, these were tactics that the Germans ended up developing in 1916 more and started using them in 1917, which involved using small groups operating in isolation, not part of large formations that infiltrate enemy formations. And these were actually quite successful in breaking elements of the stalemate in the Western Front. Rather than going off and rising up as one out of your trench and charging the enemy and getting all shot down, you sent small groups off. Small groups went off and infiltrated. They didn't move forward in mass formations. Now, this is exactly what the Boer Commando ended up using. Small groups dispersed, using the benefits of cover and concealment to not be seen, rather than large groups standing up and charging. Now, if you'd paid attention to what the Boers had done, these tactics probably would have emerged a lot sooner. Instead, it takes the Germans 3 years of stalemate to actually figure out, hey, wait a minute, maybe this could work again. And in fact, it does. Now, why is it that this happens? Why do we want to call things irregular warfare versus regular warfare? And why do we systematically sort of forget our history? I have some conjectures on this. In the paper, I don't really go into this in detail, but obviously this is the question you want to be asking. Part of it is sort of the intellectual hegemony of those who sort of deal in regular warfare. And you sort of read the importance of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and even sort of more modern theories like the Revolution in Military Affairs, which really sort of focus on the importance of winning large battles. I mean, in some ways they're more exciting to read about. In some ways they may be more reassuring to read about because they offer perhaps more sure answers. And so the power of these ideas are such that when somebody comes up and says, I think there's a different way of fighting here, I think our enemies may use different things, they're simply shouted down. And actually, if you read some of the work done in Millennium Challenge, where General Paul Van Riper went off and he was playing the Iranians in a hypothetical example. He went off and used relatively obscure tactics to sink a large part of the United States fleet, to essentially ground the United States Air Force, wreak havoc with the United States Army. And at one point in time, they stop the game and tell him he's not playing fair. They refloat the U.S. fleet. They redo the aircraft. They replace Van Riper as commander with somebody else who's going to use standard tactics, and sure enough, the Iranians are very quickly defeated, and they regard this as a success. Now, this story can be found in Andrew Krepinevich's 7 Deadly Scenarios, and it was also in Krepinevich's Foreign Affairs article based on the book. I would suggest you read it. It's very interesting how these sort of theories of the way war should be fought so dominate military planning that if somebody steps out and does something differently, they're actually told to go away, that the enemies are not going to behave that way. But it's one thing to sort of blame an intellectual hegemony, but why do we have that? Why is that allowed to persist? And I would argue that a large part of it is the enduring political appeal of the cheap, quick victory. One thing we've learned with irregular warfare is there are ways to win it, but they're painful. They are not cheap. They are not quick. You will be paying a price. And if somebody else is able to come off and say, well, here's a way to win a battle very, very quickly, very, very cheaply. You can fight remotely. You don't have to put any soldiers on the ground. You can do things from a distance, and very quickly and precisely you can go off and eliminate your enemies and achieve everything you want to achieve. Politically, this is a very seductive vision. And so on the one hand, you may blame the military for being somewhat closed-minded and believing in sort of stranger theories, but you have a political leadership that is only too happy to accept and indeed encourage this kind of thinking. And finally, you have some notion of uneasiness with some of the tactical expediencies. When you look at what the British did during the third phase of the Boer War, the British were fundamentally uncomfortable with what they were doing. When the army came out of the Boer War, on the one hand, they said never again because they didn't want to fight like that anymore, but also there was some level of personal revulsion. It was uncomfortable for the British to have to start fighting that way. They didn't like fighting women and children. They didn't like rounding up civilians. They didn't like burning farms. It was uncomfortable for them. And you saw that in actually the Franco-Prussian War as well, where Moltke didn't particularly like advocating for the destruction of the entire French civilian population. And so if you were pushed into these sort of tactical exigencies where you're going off and doing things that you, the military, are not comfortable with, you never want to go back there again. And that's perfectly understandable. But as part of that, you are willing to discard your thinking and your thoughts about irregular warfare. Now, why am I interested in this? Obviously, I'm not here as a historian of the French Revolution or the Franco-Prussian War. I am here as somebody, obviously talking about current public policy. And what concerns me today, and I actually sort of have a quote down here from Robert Gates, any future Secretary of Defense who advises the President again to send a big American land army into Asia or to the Middle East or Africa should, quote, have his head examined, end quote, as General MacArthur so delicately put it. What I find interesting about Gates's quote is he himself is quoting General MacArthur. So this has been said before, and somehow we forgot it and has to be said again, and it suggests that it may be forgotten again and may have to be said again sometime in the future. People are warning us against engaging in these kinds of wars again, but we keep finding ourselves drawn into them. Is it because they're more frequent? Is it because we have interests? Or is it because our adversaries are refusing to fight in a way that would make us easy for us to defeat them? Our adversaries and potential adversaries aren't entirely stupid either. They're going off and they're looking and seeing what tactics work against us, what tactics frustrate us, what tactics do not work against us, and what tactics end up allowing us to become very successful. And sure enough, if our adversaries fight in certain ways, the military we have, it's figured right now, could very quickly eliminate them. When you try and stand up to us conventionally, try and mass armor, try and take off an Air Force, we win very quickly. And even though we would prefer our adversaries would fight that way, that's not the way they're probably likely to fight. And so if we get called and drawn into any kind of conflict, isn't it likely that the tactics and techniques they will use will be drawn from these kinds of regular wars? And so what you have sort of coming after what we have today coming out of the Iraq and Afghanistan debates and the sort of drawdown is a very deliberate divesting of ground force structure because we're never going to do that again. We never want to have to do that again. Therefore, because we don't want to do it again, we never will have to do it again, and therefore we certainly don't need an Army or a Marine Corps that's capable of fighting those kinds of forces again. We're comfortable doing that. And one wonders if that is really a valid way of thinking about things. So certainly if it's sort of fruitful to think about things that way. You also have a discussion now about the pivot to the Pacific, which, aside from being difficult to say, is really a lot of fun to plan because it lets you build aircraft carriers, it lets you think about sort of more conventional wars and really maritime operations in a way that we haven't thought about really since World War II. But it becomes sort of an easier planning thing. It removes you from irregular warfare. And if you focus your efforts and attention on that, it's a hard problem and certainly will require a lot of material, you don't have the energy or material to go off and focus on this, this troublesome irregular thing, which because it's irregular, it's rare, we can dismiss it. Finally, thirdly, you have air-sea battle and the old and new defense transformation. One of the stunning things about air-sea battle, which is the exciting concept that has sort of gripped defense policymakers today, is that there's very little intellectual foundation behind it, and how much of it actually mirrors the discussion, if you remember the Halt problem debate in the 1990s, how do you go off and stop aggression with using only air power and sea power? It's the same argument. It's very similar stuff. And you go off and you say, well, is air-sea battle really a well thought out way of fighting in the way that, they're trying to harken back, obviously, to air, even the way they're spelling it, they're trying to go back to air-land battle, which was a very sophisticated way of dealing with Soviets' material superiority on the Western Front, or in Western Europe, or Central Europe. Does air-sea battle have those same foundations, or is it a marketing slogan for the Navy and the Air Force to take a greater share of the Army budget? And one gets the sense, at least from reading the debate right now, that it tends to be more of a marketing campaign. And defense transformation is a very dirty word, of course. Don Rumsfeld comes into office and says we're going to skip a generation of weapons, we're going to do forced transformation, we're going to do network-centric warfare. And unfortunately, events intercede, and in 2001, 2002, he's suddenly drawn into a very irregular, very nasty, very predictable kind of war. And so the defense transformation sort of stops. All the big programs that defense transformation gave us, future combat system, future imagery architecture, joint tactical radio system, all these other programs, they all get canceled. None of them deliver any product. And so transformation becomes a dirty buzzword, but one wonders if you look at the air-sea battle stuff and planning around it, you begin to hear things about generation skipping and future weapons and things along these lines. And so you wonder, how closely have we thought about regular versus irregular warfare. And finally, there's this and I recognize that I have a cyber audience here partially, and so I put this in not just to appease you, but also because I think it happens to fit, is you look at the thinking about cyber strategy. How much does it actually mirror the old thinking about nuclear deterrence? People are trying desperately to make deterrence strategies that were designed for nuclear weapons fit in a way for talking about cybersecurity. And so you see things like the Air Force looking for how do we establish cyber deterrence? You've heard you've heard them talking about nuclear options and cyber warfare in these sort of nuclear terms. The vocabulary, the words that they're using really sort of resonate with the nuclear stuff because that's the analog they know. That for them, that is the more regular analog to think about rather than cyber strategy, which I would argue is messy. It's very difficult to to grasp it, to understand how it's going to play out, to sort of plan for it. Much easier to use tried and true knowledge of nuclear deterrence, which actually people are very familiar with. Now, what I guess I really wanted to close on, what I really go back to is this notion of regularity and irregular warfare. The terms we use do matter. If you simply describe something as irregular, you've already tossed it out from your knowledge of history. You've thrown it away. If it's irregular, it's a one-off. You don't have to worry about it anymore. If it's regular, however, it becomes something you do have to concern yourself with. It's something that's going to be recurring. It's something that you're going to have to develop a solution for over and over, because you're going to have to employ it over and over again. And so in my mind, when people start talking about irregular warfare, it's not just sort of linguistic malpractice. It ends up having very serious security ramifications. And so I'm not up here as a linguist, defending the proper use of the term irregular versus regular. I'm here as someone who's really concerned about the real-world implications of dismissing things as irregular and therefore not worthy of further consideration and certainly not worthy of study and incorporation to our overall understanding of warfare. And I think when one looks at history, we keep getting drawn into these things. Even what we like to think of as regular warfare has irregular aspects. And so I think when we began to plan for how are we likely to use force in the future, and what kind of conflicts will we likely be drawn into, those irregular lessons actually seem quite pertinent. And I hope we don't forget them. And that ultimately is the message I want to leave you with. And that's that we worked. We paid a tremendous price to learn a lot of lessons that have actually made the United States very effective in sort of some of these last phases of the war. And it's very important, I think, that we not lose sight of those lessons while we begin our excited planning about more easier to plan for, but perhaps less realistic scenarios. And now I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
As a subset of irregular warfare, how do you equate the two? I mean, I remember reading an article in recent years that said that in the future, there weren't really going to be state actors. You weren't going to see state-sponsored warfare. You were going to see these sub-actors within countries, Al-Qaeda and others, and different terrorist groups fighting for their specific causes. You weren't going to see state-sponsored warfare. How do you equate the two, terrorism and irregular warfare? And do you consider terrorism a subset of that?
I would consider terrorism a subset of that. I mean, I think of terrorism as a tactic. If those who are using terrorism against us could defeat us in other ways, they would try and do so. They've just found this is a particularly effective tactic to getting our attention, and one that we haven't been able to develop pretty effective responses for yet. So whether terrorism be practiced by non-state actors, state actors, proxies, is in my mind sort of a question of strategy. And so we have to go back to using force to compel the enemies to do our will. How do we want to compel these enemies to stop striking us? Sir.
Kind of similar to his question, but about a different topic. So looking at a possible conflict with China, what falls under the rubric of irregular warfare? So like EMP weapons, electromagnetic pulse weapons, anti-ship ballistic missiles, anything I haven't mentioned, what would be considered irregular tactics in a naval air conflict, what would not? Because like you mentioned Iran, how they could inflict serious damage with irregular tactics, even to naval forces.
Right. The irregular tactics that Van Riper had the Iranians use when he played their side in the game involved putting anti-ship missiles on commercial ships and running them through the commercial sea lanes. So we couldn't distinguish between was it an oil tanker or was it an oil tanker with 3 Silkworm missiles in the back of it. So that that was kind of how he played it. As a result, when the Blue Forces went in, they lost a good chunk of their Navy because they were unable to distinguish between friend and neutral. They're certainly unable to open fire on neutral shipping in the event. So when you talk about specific adversaries, it gets a little bit harder, I think, to frame the question. I certainly think that any potential adversary is probably unlikely to face us in ways that they believe that we could easily counter. Sir.
It seems to me that the United States and Americans have a rich history with the irregular warfare. I mean, the revolutionary forces were irregulars.
Very much so.
And then after the Civil War, we fought the Indians, who fought irregularly. And they finally had to do something with it, which was sort of like what the British did to the Boers, finally herded them all together and put them in what we call them reservations. But also, it seems to me, if we forgot anything, we forgot our own history. I mean, Sam Houston was using irregulars against the Mexican army, and he won the battle. And all you have to do is say, if those guys could do it, our opponents can do the same thing. And we ought to know better.
I think you're exactly right. I think one of the things I believe was the Marine Corps went back and looked at their manuals for the Philippine insurrection and some of their activities in the Caribbean, and they discovered that the tactics they were using 100, 120 years ago were some of the most effective tactics they had, and so they dusted these manuals off and discovered that they still worked in a lot of things. And so you're right. And one that raises a larger question: why is it the United States has sort of forgotten that history, and why have we sort of embraced the high technology massed force model? That's a really interesting question. I could certainly offer some conjectures on that, as I think most people in this room could. But you're right. Forgetting that history is to our detriment. Sir.
So there is another trend, which is judicialization of warfare. Right? People expect now warfare to be conducted in a legal manner. Right? There has to be a UN resolution. There is a whole bunch of treaties that we have signed and we must adhere to. And one wonder whether, constrained by this set of judicial constraints, whether it's still possible to win irregular warfare.
Well, it's certainly a lot harder to win it if you believe the only way to win it is what the British ended up doing against the Boers and what the Prussians ended up wanting to do against the French, and what happened in these other examples. The Indian Wars are another good example. If there are ways to win it without doing that, and I think what we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan is there are tactics that are relatively effective at dealing with tactical problems that don't involve in going to those kinds of means, but they're coupled with a much more of a state building is probably the wrong term, but they're certainly with a much more of a diplomatic and social capital building type strategies for which the military is not really the executor. I mean, you have other groups coming into these situations working hand in hand with the military forces, where the military handles the military problem, and these other groups say, this is not a military problem, we're actually still trying to compel the enemy to do our will, but we're not doing it through force, we're doing it through diplomacy, we're doing it through aid and capacity building. And is that an effective way of dealing with it? Probably so, it seems like, but it's certainly expensive and time-consuming, and it may not work against all levels of adversary.
Is this is our, in my generation, the winning the hearts and minds strategy? Do you think it's ever going to work?
I think it has worked in some areas. I think also in some areas I would expand it to say win the hearts, minds, and pocketbooks of some of our adversaries. I think we may be optimistic to assume that we can convert everybody to share our goals, but I think there are a lot of people who are quite happy to just live in a world where bombs aren't always going off and where people aren't always sniping at each other, and so they may not share our goals on a lot of things, but they're at least not willing to harbor people who wish to do us ill, actively do us ill. And so it's more of a live and let live and persuade them they can live peacefully in perhaps different kinds of areas. And certainly I think there has been some progress done there. But again, it may not work in all cases. There may be some adverse areas where the level of disagreement is so strong that there's no way to form a bridge. There is no mass population to sway to want to remain neutral, which is what happened in some of these other areas. You swayed the mass population to want to remain neutral and therefore want peace, and therefore they were quite happy to help you fight the insurgents if they saw that as the easiest way to peace. Sir.
One of the things I think you might have left off the list of why the regular systems are popular is the fascination with technology. I had an experience in the Air Force where we had a new system and it wasn't working, and it was my and others' opinion that one of the reasons that the training of the crews was not up to snuff, and so there was a proposal to do some extra training, but it got absolutely nowhere. But that the authorities that be on this missile system were perfectly willing to spend tens of millions of dollars on little technological fixes that they thought were going to fix the system. It's so much more fascinating to build an airplane that goes so super fast and is stealthy and so forth than it is to train troops to do the kinds of things that and it's a heck of a lot more expensive. There's a lot more money to go around for everybody. It's more glamorous to have these battleship groups, than little boats that go here and there. So I think fascination with technology is pretty rife in today's systems.
Well, I think you're right on that, and I think if you look at the examples, you'll see the side that had the most frustration was the side that had sort of the highest technology, and it was a lot of the irregulars were those who had obsolete weapons, irregular ammunition, none of the access to heavy equipment, and even to the point where IEDs. On the one hand, cell phone is a pretty remarkable piece of technology, and so 30 years ago it would have seemed high technology, but now they're cheap commodities, and if they can be turned into detonators for homemade explosives, on the one hand that shows a level of sophistication, perhaps, but it's not high technology, certainly. And those can wreak havoc with lots of fragile high technology electronics. I think your point on technology is spot on. Sir in the back.
At what point does cyber warfare become part of the regular warfare strategy? Because right now, if you look at cyber warfare in its current state, it can be leveraged by any party. It can be done in a hit-and-run fashion. The strategy behind it is often evasive, and the way to mitigate it is nebulous at best. So is there a way to even incorporate cyber warfare into regular warfare as it is?
Well, I'm sure someone will think of one, but what I worry about cyber is that it's so new that our definition of what it is changes every time somebody uses it differently. 10 years ago, cyber warfare you had sort of a science fiction kind of thing. I think people recognized it could happen, but it was really science fiction. Then cyber warfare became what happened in Estonia. Then it became what happened in Georgia plus what happened in Estonia. Now it's Stuxnet plus Georgia plus Estonia. And what I worry about is because it's such a immature way of going off and fighting, that our definition of what it is will continue to evolve when other people use it against other folks. And that's how we will learn it. I think does cyber warfare become part of longer warfare? I think as long as you have a military that is dependent upon cyber technology to fight, then the adversary who targets cyber technology is actually targeting your military too. If you had a totally non-networked, non-high-tech military, cyber warfare wouldn't do anything against it. But as long as your military is dependent upon cyber for fighting part of the war, going after that cyber infrastructure is a potentially effective tactic. Sir.
You had mentioned the Philippines, and a quote came to mind was the way we were trying to squash the insurgents in the Philippines right after the Spanish-American War. Some of the stories that were coming back, Mark Twain was so repulsed, he said we should swap the stars on our flag with skull and bones. The tactics, I guess, that we were taking in the stories that were coming back from the Philippines. However, my question being is that in their heyday, the British were spending they prided themselves for spending more than 2 times their next 2 powers of the world in defense. Today, we spend approximately more than the next 10 countries after us in defense spending. The fact that there is such a gap between us and the rest of the world as far as defense spending, could we have effectively put the death nail in regular warfare and ushered in a whole era of irregular warfare?
Well, you're sort of asking a couple of questions there. I think the expenditures which seem high in comparison to others are part of a deliberate strategy we've chosen, which is to minimize and try and eliminate the loss of at least our own lives and minimize the lives of casualties who are not enemy combatants. As a result, we're willing to spend large sums of money to make systems that are very precise and able to do that. We could certainly we could certainly accomplish a lot of destruction for a lot less money, but I don't think that would fit into the way we're going off and fighting. Now, have we gotten to the position? I think temporarily, yes. I can't imagine anybody is going to, sail a battle fleet against the U.S. Navy, nor can I imagine they're going to, take an air wing off and go and attack the United States Air Force. For the moment, at least, we are so effective, we've built deterrence to take us on those ways. Now, if we allow that deterrence to erode, as soon as it's in somebody's interest to say, you know what, it's easier for me to defeat them by, by naval action than it is by something else, they may go off and fight. And so the question is, are you comfortable spending those sums to maintain that deterrence, to make sure that no one will attack us with air power, no one will attack us with sea power again? And that's a policy question. Ma'am.
Where does the terminology regular or irregular warfare come from? Is it just a majority of wins, losses, or is it like a Western term?
It seems to be a Western term. It seems to have really sort of come into vogue in the last 10 years, describing what it was they were doing. Because after defeating the Iraqi army in pretty short order and pretty effectively and stunningly, we ended up not, combat operations did not end. Fighting continued on, and so the term they used was irregular warfare. I'm sure it's been used before. I think I've seen it in the Vietnam stuff as well, but it's been used a lot recently, bandied about recently, to describe sort of the current situation, especially by writers looking at U.S. and Western military policy.
You reference Clausewitz's framework with strategy, operations, and then like tactical level.
Yes.
And you say that there's historically often a tactical preoccupation, that much thought going to the operational side, the strategic side. Do you feel you saw that in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, or do you still see it?
I certainly, yeah, I think you have. You spent a lot of time looking at winning Iraq and Afghanistan became, how do you defeat IEDs? How do you, do this? How do you do that? At least a lot of the discussion was focused solely on tactics. It took a while, I think, for the capacity building to come actually from outside the military. And I think the military welcomed it when it came out, because the military was really the first to tell you, hey, we don't really, we don't like this kind of stuff. We're not really good at this kind of stuff. We're good at fighting and bringing the enemy to battle. But when you started talking about all the other sort of stuff where State Department played a much more active role in USAID and things like that, yeah.
Okay, so we did adjust after a while.
Yeah, yes, but you have to look at how we adjusted as a whole country. If you look at just how the military adjusted, you're getting an incomplete picture.
Okay.
Sir, in the back.
It seems like you've detailed 3 phases of war. There's a set-piece battle, which the U.S., with its extraordinary superiority, would win in any engagement. There's the middle piece, which is the set-piece battle continuing with marginal return, and then there's the last piece, which is the irregular warfare phase. Possibly there's the 4th phase, which is reconstruction, assuming one power, the non-incumbent beat the incumbent, all right? It is clearly playing the game on our terms would simply be the set-piece battle, shock and awe, take care of business, and leave. Why do you think there's this fascination with the end game?
That's a very good question.
Why would we not play to our own strength, which is shock and awe? Let's go in, beat the tar out of them, bomb them into submission, and leave.
And you could say that on our way out, we say, don't do that again. And if you do,
we're bigger than you are. We beat you up. Goodbye.
Yeah, I think the answer to that sort of, you'd have to go back to how Americans believe their role in the world, perhaps. Is it sort of this missionary type complex? I mean, you certainly could read stuff by Samuel Huntington and others who talk about the missionaries complex and the frontier mentality and America. And my guess is those cultural explanations about our role in the world hold a lot of weight, because I think people have made the argument. Certainly, you had the sort of conservative realist response to Iraq and Afghanistan that was precisely that argument, and it got almost no traction. It got, in fact, probably got even less traction than people who were avowedly anti-war and said we shouldn't do anything. So you had the pro-war, pro the way we conducted the war faction getting a lot of traction, and you had the anti-war faction getting a lot of traction, but there were those who advocated exactly what you suggested, and aside from a few op-ed pages, they almost got no traction, and that's intriguing.
Just to interrupt, is that perhaps what our response was to Libya? And how and how not, I guess.
Well, Libya was a very interesting case because I'm not sure I saw a threat coming out of Libya at all. And in many ways, you may look at it and say, well, here was I think it was our position in Libya up until we went into Libya in many ways, because here was an odious regime led by a nasty man. Who, after we struck him very hard in the 1980s, basically stopped making mischief for us. He may have made mischief elsewhere, but he stopped making mischief for us. And he had seemed to have learned that lesson. Now we took it a little bit further this time. And so you wonder what's our ability to offer that bargain to another odious individual in the future. Would they ever trust us again if we would come in and say, all right, leave us alone and you're free to do what you want? But Libya is a really intriguing question. Sir.
The first George Bush did the shock and awe in Iraq and got out, and he got unelected for that. In other words, that was uncool. In the final analysis, everybody applauded when it happened, but it immediately taught the one-term president. And the second one came in and did it the other way and kept it going and tried to reach out to the Iraqi people, bring in help the Iraqi people get back control of their homeland. And that didn't work out too well for him either in the final analysis.
He was elected.
What now?
He was elected.
Well,
he was reelected.
For a period of time, and then, I don't know, it just kind of went downhill from there as the war went on. I don't know. I toss that out as for the practicality. The question above that came about whether or not shock and awe and get out is an appropriate response in a country like ours, and I'm not sure that it is.
Yeah, and I think if that's the case, then you have to go back to what is it about American political culture that would let a president who take that state lose an election. Although I think the tax situation had a lot to do with it too. But certainly, yeah.
There may have been other things. So that's
Ma'am.
Well, we have works like Clausewitz, Principles of War, Sun Tzu's Art of War. Do you think anyone would ever come out with like a work about fighting irregular warfare?
Well, I think what's interesting about Sun Tzu and Clausewitz is, depending on how you read them, they're they have a lot to tell you about irregular warfare. Because they tell you to stop focusing on the tactics and start focusing on why it is that people are fighting and how they're controlling their fight. That's what Clausewitz does, and Sun Tzu talks a little bit more about intelligence and deception and things like that, which also I think are relatively important. What I worry about in some ways is that Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, in part because nobody ever actually reads them, they just read a few quotations out of them, and also because they are very dense. Clausewitz is dialectic writing. Sun Tzu is these weird little aphorisms strung together. It's really easy for someone who has an agenda to write a summary of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu in such a way that it looks like they're supporting major theater war or regular warfare or anything like that. So in some ways, I think you could argue that like any great piece of philosophy, they can be used and abused. And so I don't think we need another great piece of philosophy to be used or abused. Sir.
It seemed to me maybe it would help our thinking instead of thinking in terms of conventional war and the irregular war. We thought of it just as a continuum and different, as more a change in tactics, but not in strategy. The person fighting our opponent who's attacking us using irregular warfare has the same objective as one who, if he had conventional capabilities, would use that if he thought he could win with it. But knowing that he can't, then he uses the irregular. But we need to be thinking in terms of what does it take to defeat the opponent, and that depends on what he's bringing against us.
Yeah, I think Steve Biddle has just done some fascinating work on modern tactics, and his study of the Lebanon, of the Israeli campaign in Lebanon, the Israeli campaign in Lebanon recently, is a wonderful illustration of just that. I mean, he builds this tactical continuum. He says that's really what you have, is you have these different kinds of tactics that you map along, but the objectives are the same all the time. So I think you're precisely right. And if you start confusing different tactics with different kinds of war, that leads you down all sorts of bad rat holes. Sir.
Can you think of examples where irregular warfare has been used other than against an occupying force?
I'm sure I could. Nothing's springing immediately to mind.
I mean, that's one of the things that makes it hard to think of it just as a continuation of a set-piece kind of warfare. Because it's unique to that situation. The side that's pursuing irregular warfare, their objective is typically to get the other people to leave.
Right.
Necessarily to defeat them in a large
Special forces.
Special forces. That's an excellent example. So he gets the credit for thinking of it. But yes, you can go off and do that. But I think you're right. Largely it is. I mean, in the case of the Vendée, it's a little bit different because they sort of set themselves up as their own autonomous, loyal to the King of France, and therefore they were the real France, and so they were invaded by the Republicans. But yeah, that's an excellent addition. You're right.
Do we have time for maybe one more question?
Sir?
Do you think Israel's going to attack Iran?
Is that right?
Look, I don't claim to be an expert, but certainly as one who's been reading the news, I think they've been doing it already. I mean, some of the actions that have been taken, against the Iranian nuclear program are not. I mean, I don't want to attribute that to just a fickle finger of fate and random chance. I mean, it certainly seems like people are trying desperately to slow that thing down without having to resort to a larger show of force. And I think as long as the Iranians continue to ignore the signs that people aren't happy that they're pursuing that path, people who are unhappy may pick more significant signs.
It seemed to me that we are conducting irregular warfare against the Iranians by cutting off their bank accounts. We have a strategy, and we're using tactics that are irregular to force them to stop doing something that we don't want them to be doing, which is what warfare is. It's your definition, using force to make somebody submit to your will. And so we cut off their bank accounts, we cut off their trade, we're going to starve them out, etc., hoping to not have to use physical force.
If people did have further questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards, but thank you.
Small token from the Institute to you.
Well, thank you.